The drive to the mountains was supposed to be simple. A weekend getaway for 5 friends, an escape from the suffocating grind of their lives. The plan had been years in the making, postponed too many times by exams, job promotions, and failed relationships. Now, at last, they were on the road. Alyssa sat in the passenger seat, scrolling through playlists on her phone. "Why do none of you have good taste in music?" she teased, clicking her seatbelt in frustration as an EDM track crackled through the speakers. "Because we're normal," Ethan quipped, his eyes on the empty highway ahead. His hands tightened on the wheel as he glanced at the GPS. "Why does this thing keep rerouting? It's like it's drunk." From the back seat, Jamie leaned forward. "You updated it before we left, right?" "Of course," Ethan snapped, tapping the dashboard screen with growing irritation. Behind them, Naomi and Derek whispered to each other, heads pressed together. Naomi broke away long enough to point out the window. "Look at that fog rolling in." Ethan glanced to his right. The fog was unnaturally thick, the kind that seemed to eat the edges of the road. It crept closer, smothering the orange glow of the setting sun. "Relax," Ethan muttered, more to himself than anyone else. He adjusted the GPS again. "It's just a detour. We'll be back on the main road in no time." But time stretched unervingly. The smooth pavement gave way to cracked asphalt. The pine trees flanking the road grew denser, their limbs intertwining like claws. The fog slithered between them, thick enough to blot out the moon. Alyssa peered at her phone. No service. Jamie, in the back, frowned at his own screen. "Same here. Did anyone check to see if this road is even on the map?" "It's a detour," Ethan said again, but his voice cracked slightly. They fell into a tense silence. The road narrowed further, forcing Ethan to slow down. When the first wooden sign appeared out of the mist, they almost didn't notice it. "Wait!" Naomi cried, pointing. Ethan hit the brakes. The sign was weathered and crooked, its faded letters spelling out, "Welcome to Darrington." Alyssa glanced back at Jamie. "Ever heard of this place?" Jamie shook his head. "Doesn't ring a bell. We don't have time for sightseeing," Ethan muttered, though his knuckles were white on the steering wheel. He drove forward cautiously, the headlights cutting through the fog. Darrington emerged slowly, piece by piece. First, the sagging roofs of old houses, their windows dark and lifeless. Then a single street lamp flickering weakly over an empty intersection. "Where is everyone?" Naomi whispered. "Maybe they're all asleep," Derek suggested half-heartedly, but his voice was uncertain. Ethan pulled the car to a stop in front of what appeared to be a diner. The neon sign above it blinked weakly, spelling YTS in sputtering red light. "We're not staying here," Ethan said firmly. "But we need directions," Naomi countered. "If we can find anyone." "No one lives here," Jamie said, staring at the row of darkened storefronts. Alyssa opened her door, stepping out before Ethan could argue. The fog coiled around her legs, swallowing the sound of her boots crunching on the gravel. "We'll be quick," she said, her breath visible in the unnaturally cold air. One by one, the others followed her. Behind them, the car's engine clicked softly as it cooled, and then the lights in the diner flickered on. Alyssa turned to the others, her face pale. "Okay, that's creepy." Ethan sighed. "Come on, let's make this fast." The door to the diner swung open as they approached, the bell above it jingling softly. No one was there to greet them, just empty red booths and a counter with a row of cracked stools. Alyssa leaned toward the counter. "Hello?" Her voice echoed unnaturally in the confined space. On the far wall, a mirror hung above the coffee machines. As the group stepped inside, their reflections followed, but there was something off about them, something that no one noticed. Yet, the diner felt wrong, like stepping into a photograph where the colors had faded and the subjects didn't know they were being watched. The smell of stale coffee and grease hung in the air, but no heat emanated from the griddle or the old coffee pots lined along the counter. "Is anyone here?" Alyssa called again, louder this time. Her voice echoed, each repetition slower and softer than the last, until it faded into an unnerving silence. "Let's grab directions and go," Ethan muttered, his eyes darting to the fogged-up windows. Outside, the mist had thickened, obscuring their car entirely. Naomi approached the counter and found a laminated menu, the kind you'd expect in a greasy spoon. But the text was smudged, as if someone had tried to erase it. "That's weird," she murmured, holding it up. "What is—" Jamie asked, leaning over her shoulder. "The menu's just blank." "Almost." She squinted. "It's like words were here once, but they're gone now." A soft jingle broke the silence. The bell above the door swayed slightly, as if someone had just walked in. "Was that us?" Derek whispered. Ethan shook his head. "We've been standing here for at least 5 minutes." Alyssa turned toward the mirror on the far wall. Her reflection stared back, but something about it made her stomach churn. She tilted her head slightly, watching as the image followed suit. But the motion wasn't fluid. It was delayed, fractional, yet enough to set her nerves on edge. "Guys," Alyssa's voice cracked as she took a step closer to the mirror. "What now?" Ethan grumbled, his patience already fraying. "I think the mirror—" A loud clatter came from the kitchen, cutting her off. Everyone spun toward the noise. Pots and pans rattled, their metallic clang echoing through the diner. "Hello," Jamie called, stepping cautiously toward the swinging door that led to the kitchen. It moved slightly, creaking on its hinges. "Don't," Naomi started, but Jamie had already reached out, pushing the door open. The kitchen was empty. It shouldn't have been. The counters were clean, the floors swept, yet everything about the room screamed abandonment. A single knife rested on the cutting board, its blade pointing toward a sink filled with stagnant water. Jamie frowned. "There's no one." The door swung shut, cutting him off from the others. "Jamie!" Naomi yelled, rushing forward and yanking it open. But the kitchen was empty now, the knife gone from the cutting board. "Where did he go?" Alyssa asked, her voice trembling. "He was just here," Naomi insisted, stepping inside and frantically looking around. The others hesitated, peering through the doorway, but unwilling to cross the threshold. Derek's foot hovered over the linoleum as if some primal instinct was screaming not to go in. "I'm here!" Jamie's voice rang out, but it sounded distant, muffled. Alyssa spun around. The voice hadn't come from the kitchen. It came from the mirror. Their reflections stood frozen, unmoving, while Jamie's image stared at them from the glass. He banged his fists against the invisible barrier, his mouth moving silently before his voice broke through again. "Get me out!" Naomi gasped, backing away. "This isn't real. It can't be real. What the hell is happening?" Ethan demanded, his voice cracking under the strain. Jamie's reflection turned, looking over its shoulder. The mirrored version of the diner stretched out into a corridor that wasn't there in the physical world. The faint glow of symbols burned on the walls behind him, their patterns shifting and pulsing like a heartbeat. "Do you see that?" Jamie asked from the other side of the glass, his breath fogging up the surface. "See what?" Derek whispered, his voice hollow. Jamie looked back at them, his face pale. The symbols, they're moving. As the group stared, their own reflections slowly began to shift. Not in sync, but subtly, an unnatural twitch of a hand, a smile that hadn't been made. "Let's get out of here," Ethan barked, grabbing Alyssa's arm. But when they turned toward the door, they froze. The fog had seeped inside. It curled around their feet like smoke, thickening with each breath. Outside the diner, the town was gone. There were no buildings, no streets, only an endless, shifting white void. And the door to the diner wouldn't budge. Ethan's hands gripped the door handle, yanking with all his strength. The hinges creaked, but the door refused to open. "It's jammed," he shouted, his voice echoing through the empty diner. "Jammed?" Naomi's voice trembled as she glanced over her shoulder at the mirror. Jamie's reflection was still there, but he was no longer alone. In the glass, shadowy figures emerged behind him, flickering into existence one by one. They were human-shaped but wrong, bent at strange angles, their limbs impossibly long and thin. They moved without stepping, gliding forward as though carried by the air itself. Jamie turned, noticing them for the first time. "What are they?" His voice cracked, rising in panic. He pounded on the glass again. "Get me out of here!" "Shut up!" Ethan snapped, his tone more desperate than angry. "We're trying to figure this out." Alyssa stepped closer to the mirror, her breath fogging the surface. The symbols behind Jamie glowed brighter now, their pulsating rhythm speeding up. It's like they're alive, she murmured. What's alive? Derek asked, backing toward the counter. The symbols, Alyssa said, pointing at the mirror. They're moving with the shadows. Look, Naomi stared at the reflections, shaking her head. I don't care about the symbols. We need to get Jamie out of there. As the group argued, the fog inside the diner thickened, rising to their knees. It clung to them, chilling their skin. Derek felt something brush against his ankle, and he jumped back, his breath coming in short gasps. Something's in here, he whispered. Don't start, Ethan muttered, still yanking on the door. No, seriously, Derek insisted, his voice rising. Something just touched me. From the kitchen came a soft clatter. All heads turned toward the swinging door. That wasn't there before, Naomi said, her voice barely above a whisper. Let's not split up again, Ethan growled, releasing the door handle and moving toward the others. Alyssa's gaze snapped back to the mirror. Jamie was screaming now, but no sound came from his mouth. The shadowy figures were closer to him, their twisted shapes blocking out the faint symbols on the walls. Then the mirror began to change. The reflections of Alyssa, Ethan, Naomi, and Derek turned to face the glass directly, each one staring out at them with dead, expressionless eyes. What the hell? Ethan muttered, stepping back. Their reflections didn't blink, didn't breathe. They simply stared unflinching, while Jamie's form faded into the background. Naomi reached out a trembling hand toward the glass. Jamie, are you still there? Before her fingers could touch the surface, the diner lights flickered violently. The air filled with a low hum, like the deep vibration of an unseen engine revving to life. The reflections moved. Ethan's reflection took a step forward, slamming its hands against the glass. Naomi's did the same, then Derek's. Their movements were jerky, almost mechanical, but the force was real. The mirror trembled with each impact. Alyssa stumbled backward. What's happening? The reflections' mouths opened in unison, too wide, stretching until their faces split unnaturally. Ethan grabbed Naomi's arm and pulled her toward the counter. Everyone stay together. Don't touch the mirror. Derek tripped over a bar stool, falling hard onto the tiled floor. The fog swirled around him, thickening as if it had a mind of its own. He coughed, flailing against the icy tendrils wrapping around his wrists. Help me, he choked out, his voice muffled by the growing mist. Naomi reached for him, but Ethan yanked her back. We can't. Yes, we can, she screamed, breaking free of his grasp and lunging for Derek. But the fog dragged Derek backward, pulling him toward the mirror. His reflection mirrored the action perfectly, clawing at the glass as though trying to escape. Alyssa grabbed Derek's arm, but the fog was relentless, pulling harder. Let go, she cried, tears streaming down her face. Derek's eyes locked with hers, wide with terror. Don't let me go. Please. The humming noise grew deafening. The symbols in the mirror flared brightly, and the glass seemed to ripple like water. And then, with a final pull, Derek was gone. The diner went silent. Naomi fell to her knees, staring at the spot where Derek had vanished. The fog receded slightly, retreating into the corners of the room like a living thing satisfied with its hunt. Alyssa turned to the mirror. Derek's reflection now stood beside Jamie, his face slack and pale. The shadowy figures were nowhere to be seen. He's still in there, Alyssa whispered, her voice barely audible. Ethan's jaw tightened. He pulled a bar stool from the counter and hurled it at the mirror. The stool shattered on impact, splinters raining to the floor, but the glass remained unscathed. Damn it, Ethan yelled, kicking the wall in frustration. Naomi covered her face with her hands, sobbing. What do we do now? The lights flickered again, and a low, guttural sound rumbled through the diner. Alyssa turned toward the windows. The fog outside had begun to shift, swirling faster, shapes forming and dissolving within it. The town, she murmured, her voice trembling. It's watching us. The footsteps grew louder, each one echoing unnaturally in the confined diner. They came from nowhere and everywhere at once. as though the walls themselves were amplifying the sound. Ethan's voice cracked. "Who's there?" Naomi gripped the back of a booth, her knuckles white. "We need to leave. Now." "Where, Naomi?" Ethan snapped, gesturing at the door. "Into that." He pointed to the fog, which pressed thick and impenetrable against the windows. Derek moved closer to the mirror, his breath fogging up the glass as he leaned in to study it. Their reflections had fully turned away now, gazing intently at the mirrored corridor. Shapes flickered faintly in the distance, shadows moving toward the glass, too far away to make out clearly. "Something's coming," Derek whispered. Another loud bang reverberated through the diner, shaking the light fixtures. The group huddled together instinctively, their eyes darting to every corner of the room. "It's like it's trying to hurt us," Alyssa muttered. Ethan gritted his teeth. "Well, it's doing a damn good job." Naomi tugged on Derek's sleeve, her voice trembling. "Derek, get away from the mirror." But he didn't move. His gaze remained locked on the approaching shadows, his face pale. "I think they're us," he said. "What?" Alyssa asked, stepping closer. "In the mirror," Derek said, his voice hollow. "Those shadows, they're us. I can tell. They move like us. Look, that one, it's Jamie." He pointed to a shadow in the far distance, limping slightly as it moved. Ethan grabbed Derek's shoulder and yanked him back. "I don't care what you think they are. We're not waiting around to find out." The footsteps stopped. Silence. Then came a low, guttural whisper from the direction of the kitchen. It was faint, but the words were unmistakable. "Don't leave." The group froze, their eyes darting toward the swinging door. It moved slightly, creaking as though pushed by an invisible hand. Naomi whimpered, tears pooling in her eyes. "What does it want from us?" "We can't just sit here and wait for it to kill us," Ethan said, his voice rising. "We need to fight back." "Fight what?" Alyssa shot back. "We don't even know what it is." Another whisper filled the room, louder this time. "Stay." The mirror crackled, drawing their attention. Their reflections had started moving again, but they weren't mimicking the group. Instead, they were pressing their hands against the glass, as if trying to break through. "Nope," Ethan said, stepping away. "Nope, I'm done." "Wait," Derek said, pointing to the mirror. One of the symbols was glowing brighter than the rest, a spiral with jagged lines cutting through it. As they watched, the glow seemed to pulse in rhythm with the group's breathing. "What does it mean?" Naomi asked, her voice tight with fear. Derek shook his head. "I don't know, but Jamie said the symbols were important. Maybe it's trying to show us a way out." Alyssa squinted at the glowing spiral. Her breath fogged up the glass, and the symbol dimmed slightly. She reached out but hesitated, her hand trembling just inches from the surface. "What if it's a trap?" she asked. "Do we have a choice?" Derek said, glancing at the kitchen door. Another loud bang made the decision for them. This time, the sound came from the front door. Alyssa's fingers brushed the symbol. The diner convulsed violently, the floor buckling beneath their feet. The group stumbled as the fog outside the windows surged inward, swallowing the light. The diner's walls began to shift, elongating unnaturally. The booths stretched into grotesque shapes, their edges melting into the floor. "We have to go," Ethan shouted, grabbing Naomi's arm. But the door didn't budge. The fog was too thick now, pressing against the glass like a living thing. Behind them, the mirror cracked again. A single word appeared in the fog surface, written as though traced by an unseen hand. "Run." The diner exploded into chaos. The walls seemed to breathe, flexing inward as if the building itself was alive and closing in. The sound of the mirrors shattering into 1,000 pieces filled the air, followed by the chilling whisper that echoed through the fog. "Stay forever." The group bolted. Ethan threw his shoulder into the diner door, and it finally gave way with a deafening crack, spilling them into the dense, swirling fog. The mist curled around them, damp and suffocating, making it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. "Where's the car?" Naomi cried, clutching Alyssa's arm. "It was right here," Derek shouted, spinning in place. But there was no car, no street, no diner, only the endless fog. "Just keep moving," Ethan barked, grabbing Naomi by the wrist and pulling her forward. The group stumbled blindly through the fog, their footsteps muffled by the damp ground. Shadows flickered at the edges of their vision, shapes that seemed to dissolve whenever they turned to look. "It's changing," Alyssa gasped. "What is?" Derek asked, his voice shaking. "The ground, the streets, it's all moving." The fog began to thin just enough to reveal their surroundings. The town had transformed. Streets they had walked down moments ago were now unrecognizable. Buildings jutted out at strange angles, their facades warped and twisted. Doors led nowhere, opening into blank walls or endless voids. "It's like a maze," Naomi whispered, her voice trembling. "We need to split up," Ethan said suddenly. "What?" Alyssa snapped, turning on him. "Are you insane?" "It's the only way," Ethan insisted. "If we stick together, we'll just keep running in circles. If we split up, someone might find a way out and come back for the rest." "No way," Naomi said, shaking her head vehemently. "We stay together. Fine itan graud. Then let's keep moving." The group pressed forward, weaving through the twisting streets. Every turn seemed to lead them deeper into the labyrinth, and the town grew darker with each passing moment. The fog thickened again, clinging to their skin and muffling their panicked breaths. They came to a sudden stop when they reached a dead end. A massive brick wall loomed in front of them, its surface covered in the same glowing symbols from the mirror. "What now?" Derek asked, his voice breaking. Alyssa approached the wall, her hand trembling as she traced one of the symbols. "Jamie said these were important," she murmured. Maybe this is a clue." "What kind of clue?" Naomi asked. Alyssa's fingers hovered over a spiral symbol etched into the brick. The lines pulsed faintly, almost like they were alive. "I think it's a choice," Alyssa said softly. "What do you mean, a choice?" Ethan snapped. She turned to face the group, her face pale. "I don't think we all get out of here. These symbols, they're a way forward, but they demand something in return." A heavy silence fell over them. "What kind of sacrifice?" Derek asked hesitantly. Before Alyssa could answer, a shadow moved at the edge of the fog. It was tall and humanoid, but its limbs were impossibly long, and its head tilted at an unnatural angle. "Run," Alyssa whispered, backing away from the wall. The group turned and fled, the shadow moving silently behind them. Its presence was suffocating, a crushing weight that bore down on them as they ran. The fog parted briefly, revealing a narrow alley between two warped buildings. "This way," Ethan shouted, leading them into the alley. But the space seemed to stretch as they ran, the exit growing farther and farther away. Behind them, the shadow grew closer, its long limbs scraping against the walls. Alyssa stumbled, falling to her knees. "Go," she screamed, waving them on. Ethan hesitated for a moment before grabbing Naomi and Derek and pulling them forward. Alyssa's screams echoed through the fog as the shadow reached her, its long fingers curling around her shoulders. The alley suddenly ended, and the remaining three burst into an open square. A clock tower loomed in the center, its hands frozen at midnight. The fog swirled around its base, almost like it was alive. "Where's Alyssa?" Naomi sobbed, collapsing onto the cobblestones. Ethan and Derek didn't answer. They were too busy staring at the clock tower, where Alyssa's reflection now shimmered faintly in the glass face. Her mouth moved silently, forming a single word: "Run!" The frozen hands of the clock tower loomed above them, casting distorted shadows onto the fog-covered square. Alyssa's reflection flickered in the glass face, her lips still forming the same silent plea. "Run!" Naomi clutched her chest, gasping for breath as the weight of everything crashed down on her. "She's gone. Alyssa's gone," she whispered, her voice cracking. Ethan crouched next to her, his jaw clenched. "We don't have time to fall apart. If we stay here, we're next." Naomi glared at him, her face streaked with tears. "She saved us, and now you just want to act like she didn't exist." "That's not what Ethan started, but Derek interrupted. "Enough!" Derek snapped, his voice louder than they'd ever heard it. He pointed toward the clock tower. "Look!" They turned toward the glass face of the clock. The reflection of the square was clear, but something was off. Their reflections were standing in the square, but they weren't moving. Instead, they were staring straight up, their heads tilted unnaturally far back. "They're watching something," Naomi whispered. Ethan squinted, following their reflected gazes. Above the clock tower, something shifted in the fog. It was massive, a shape too large to comprehend. The fog swirled around it, obscuring its details, but the weight of its presence pressed down on them, making it hard to breathe. Naomi's legs buckled, and she fell to her knees. "What is that?" Ethan didn't answer. His throat felt dry, and his heartbeat thundered in his ears. Derek took a step closer to the clock tower, his eyes fixed on the shifting reflection. "It's alive." The thing above the tower moved, its form rippling like liquid, but its eyes, dark, infinite voids, pierced through the fog, locking onto them. A voice filled the air, not spoken but felt, vibrating in their bones. "Stay!" Naomi screamed, clutching her head as the word echoed endlessly in her mind. Ethan grabbed her arm, pulling her up. "We need to move. Now!" Derek hesitated, his gaze fixed on the reflection. "It's not letting us leave," he said softly. "It's watching us. We're a part of it now." "No," Ethan snapped, gripping Derek by the shoulders and shaking him. "We're not staying here. Do you hear me? We're getting out of this nightmare." Naomi's eyes darted around the square. The buildings were shifting again, their edges warping and melting into one another. Doorways appeared and disappeared, like the town itself was breathing. "The alley," Naomi said suddenly, pointing toward a narrow gap between two crumbling buildings. Ethan followed her gaze, nodding. "Let's go." He dragged Derek with him as Naomi led the way into the alley. The fog closed in behind them, swallowing the square and the clock tower. The oppressive voice faded, but the silence it left behind was worse. The alley twisted unnaturally, curving in ways that defied logic. The walls seemed to pulse, the bricks shifting like muscles beneath skin. "Are we even going the right way?" Naomi asked, her voice trembling. "It doesn't matter," Ethan said through gritted teeth. "We can't stop." The group stumbled through the maze-like passages, their footsteps echoing unnaturally in the confined space. The fog thinned slightly, revealing more symbols carved into the walls. "These symbols," Derek muttered, running his fingers over one. "They're the same as before. What if they're trying to show us something?" "Like what?" Ethan snapped, his patience fraying. Derek pointed to a symbol that glowed faintly, its spiral shape pulsating rhythmically. "Like a way out." Naomi leaned in closer, her hand trembling as she reached out to touch the glowing spiral. "What if it's another trap?" she asked. Derek shook his head. "It's all we have." Before Ethan could stop her, Naomi pressed her hand against the symbol. The alley erupted into chaos. The walls trembled violently, splitting open to reveal another path. But with it came a chorus of whispers, growing louder with each passing second. The fog ahead of them swirled, and figures began to emerge. At first, they were shapeless shadows, but as they drew closer, their forms became disturbingly familiar. "They're us," Naomi whispered, backing away. The figures were identical copies of the group, their expressions blank and their eyes glowing faintly. The doppelgangers moved in perfect unison, blocking the newly revealed path. "What do we do now?" Derek asked, his voice shaking. Ethan clenched his fists, his mind racing. "We fight." Naomi stared at him in horror. "How do you fight yourself?" The doppelgangers stood motionless in the alley, their blank expressions illuminated faintly by the glowing symbols on the walls. Their presence was oppressive, radiating an unnatural stillness that felt heavier than the fog. "They're just standing there," Naomi whispered, gripping Ethan's arm. "For now," Ethan muttered, stepping in front of her. His voice wavered, but his jaw was set in determination. "They're blocking the way. If we can get through..." "And do what?" Derek interrupted, his voice laced with panic. "We don't even know if there's anything on the other side." Naomi glanced at the glowing spiral symbol on the wall, then back at the unmoving doppelgangers. "Jamie said the symbols were important. Maybe they're..." Part of the rules here. Rules? Ethan asked, glaring at her. You think this nightmare has rules? Naomi stepped forward despite her trembling hands, her eyes locking on her own double. The doppelganger mimicked her movement, tilting its head slightly as if in recognition. It's me, she whispered, her voice hollow. Naomi, don't. Ethan warned, but it was too late. Naomi reached out, her fingers trembling as they neared the copy's face. Before she could touch it, the doppelganger's hand shot up, mirroring her motion with terrifying precision. Their fingers almost met, separated by a fraction of an inch, when the copy's lips curled into a faint, chilling smile. It's watching, the doppelganger said, its voice distorted, like a recording played backward. Naomi stumbled back with a scream, clutching her chest. The doppelganger's smile widened, its head tilting at an unnatural angle. Move! Ethan shouted, grabbing Naomi and pulling her away. The doppelgangers began to move as well, their limbs jerking mechanically. Each one mimicked its counterpart with grotesque accuracy, mirroring their movements, but with a delayed, almost glitchy rhythm. They're copying us, Derek whispered, his eyes darting between the figures. Then don't let them, Ethan growled. He picked up a loose brick from the ground and hurled it at his double. The brick connected with a sickening thud, shattering part of the figure's face. A dark, tar-like substance oozed from the wound, but the copy didn't flinch. Instead, it reached up and touched its face, tilting its head as if curious. The doppelganger's movements became erratic, their jerky motions accelerating. The copies of Ethan, Naomi, and Derek began to advance, their glowing eyes fixed intently on their originals. We need to get through, Naomi shouted, pointing at the path behind the figures. Ethan grabbed her hand. Stay close. The group surged forward, weaving between the doppelgangers as they lashed out with stiff, unnatural movements. The air felt heavier with each step, and the glowing symbols on the walls seemed to pulse faster, as if urging them on. Naomi screamed as her doppelganger grabbed her arm, its fingers ice-cold and unyielding. She twisted free, stumbling forward just as Derek shoved his double aside. Don't stop, Ethan barked, his voice cutting through the chaos. The fog ahead began to thin, revealing another open space. The doppelgangers hesitated at the edge of the alley, their movements slowing until they stood perfectly still, watching as the group stumbled into the clearing. Ethan doubled over, gasping for breath. What the hell were those things? They weren't us, Derek said, his voice hollow. Not really. Naomi shuddered, wrapping her arms around herself. They said, it's watching. Ethan looked at her sharply. What's watching? Before she could answer, a low, rumbling sound filled the clearing. The ground trembled beneath their feet, and the fog began to swirl violently around the edges of the space. In the center of the clearing, the cobblestone shifted, rising and falling like waves. Slowly, a massive, jagged structure emerged from the ground, its surface covered in the same glowing symbols. It's a door, Naomi whispered. The structure loomed above them, its edges flickering as if it wasn't entirely solid. The spiral symbol at its center glowed brightest of all, pulsing with a rhythm that matched their racing hearts. Derek stepped closer, his eyes fixed on the door. This has to be the way out. Ethan frowned, glancing back at the alley. The doppelgangers still stood there, their glowing eyes visible through the thinning fog. If this is the way out, he said cautiously, why isn't it trying to stop us? Naomi hesitated, her gaze darting between the door and the doppelgangers. Because it doesn't need to, she said softly. What do you mean? Derek asked. Naomi stepped toward the door, her hand hovering over the spiral. This place, it's alive. It wants us to choose. Ethan's stomach dropped. Choose what? Naomi looked back at him, tears brimming in her eyes. Which one of us gets to leave? Naomi's words hung in the air like a death sentence. Ethan stepped forward, shaking his head. That can't be right. There's no way this thing wants us to sacrifice someone. Naomi interrupted, her voice trembling. That's what it's been leading us toward. The symbols, the doppelgangers, everything, it's a test. And this door, she gestured to the towering structure. It only opens if someone stays behind. Derek's face paled. How do you know that? How can you be sure? I don't, Naomi admitted, tears spilling down her cheeks. But it feels right, like it's been telling me all along. We've seen what happens to people who get left behind. They don't just stay here, they become this place. Ethan clenched his fists, pacing furiously. There has to be another way. We can't just, he trailed off, his voice breaking. Naomi turned to him, her eyes desperate. Do you think I want this? Do you think I want to choose who dies? The ground rumbled beneath them, the glowing spiral on the door pulsing faster. The symbols on its surface shifted, forming shapes that resembled hands reaching out, beckoning. It's running out of patience, Derek said quietly, his gaze fixed on the door. Ethan spun around to face him. You're awfully calm about this. I'm not calm, Derek snapped. I'm terrified. But Naomi's right. This place isn't going to let us leave until it gets what it wants. Naomi wiped her tears and took a shaky breath. We need to decide. The words cut through Ethan like a blade. Decide, he spat. How are we supposed to decide something like that? Maybe we draw straws, Derek suggested weakly, but even he looked disgusted by the idea. Are you serious? Ethan shouted, advancing on him. You're talking about murdering one of us like it's some kind of game. It's not a game, Derek yelled back, his voice echoing through the clearing. It's survival. If we don't do something, none of us get out. Naomi stepped between them, her voice breaking as she screamed. Stop it. Just stop. The ground shook violently, the fog swirling into towering spires around them. The doppelgangers began to move again, stepping into the clearing, their glowing eyes fixed on the group. It's watching, Naomi whispered, staring at the doppelgangers. It's waiting for us to decide. Ethan's chest heaved as he looked between Naomi and Derek. We can't do this, he said, his voice barely audible. There has to be another way. There isn't, Naomi said softly. The rumbling intensified, and the symbols on the door began to glow so brightly that it hurt to look at them. It's now or never, Derek said, his voice trembling. Naomi stepped forward, placing her hand on the glowing spiral. She turned to face the others, her expression calm but resolute. I'll do it. Ethan froze. What? No. I'll stay, Naomi said, tears streaming down her face. You too can leave. No, Ethan said again, shaking his head. We're not leaving you behind. It has to be someone, Naomi said, her voice breaking. If it's not me, then who? The doppelgangers moved closer, their steps slow and deliberate. Their distorted forms loomed over the group, silent but menacing. Ethan turned to Derek, his eyes blazing. We'll fight them. We'll figure out another way. Derek shook his head. You've seen what this place can do. We can't fight it, Ethan. If we don't do this now, none of us are getting out. Naomi's hand pressed harder against the spiral, and the door began to shift, its surface rippling like water. A faint light spilled from the cracks, illuminating the clearing. Go, Naomi whispered, her voice cracking. Before I lose my nerve. No, Ethan shouted, grabbing her arm. We're not doing this. I won't let you. Naomi pulled away, tears streaming down her face as she smiled faintly. You have to live, both of you, for me. The light from the door intensified, and the doppelgangers froze in place, their glowing eyes fixed on Naomi. Before Ethan could stop her, the ground beneath her feet began to sink. She looked up at him one last time, her smile fading as the fog swallowed her whole. The door swung open with a deafening roar, revealing a blinding, golden light beyond. Ethan and Derek stood frozen, staring at the open door. She's gone, Derek whispered. Ethan clenched his fists, his heart breaking as he turned toward the light. She didn't have to be. Ethan and Derek stood at the edge of the blinding light spilling from the open door, their breaths ragged and shallow. The clearing behind them was silent now, the doppelgangers frozen in place, their glowing eyes dimming as the fog began to recede. She's really gone, Derek whispered, his voice hollow. Ethan couldn't bring himself to answer. His legs felt heavy, his chest tight as he stared at the swirling light. It beckoned to them, promising an escape, but every fiber of his being screamed that it wasn't right. Not without her. We don't have a choice, Derek said, stepping forward. He hesitated at the threshold, his body trembling. "We can't stay here." Ethan finally found his voice, raw and filled with anguish. "And what if it's another trick? What if this door isn't an escape? What if it's worse?" Derek turned to him, his face pale but resolute. "Then we deal with it, because staying here is the only thing worse than going through that door." The door groaned as if it were alive, the light within flickering faintly. The pulsing spiral symbol reappeared, its rhythm slowing, almost like a heartbeat beginning to fail. "It's closing," Derek muttered. Ethan clenched his fists, his mind racing. He glanced back at the clearing one last time. The doppelgangers stood still, their forms hazy and dissolving into the fog. The shifting town was quiet now, as if it too were holding its breath. He looked back at the door and swallowed hard. "Fine," he said, his voice barely audible. "Let's go." Together, they stepped into the light. For a moment, there was nothing but blinding whiteness, a suffocating emptiness that pressed against their bodies. Then the light shifted, fracturing into a kaleidoscope of images. Ethan stumbled, his footing unsteady as the ground beneath him twisted and warped. He saw flashes of the town, the diner, the clock tower, the glowing symbols, all spinning around him like fragments of a shattered memory. "Where are we?" Derek's voice echoed, distant and warped. Ethan tried to focus, his eyes straining against the chaos. The images slowed, coalescing into a single scene. They were standing on a familiar road, the asphalt cracked and overgrown with weeds. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a pale, golden light. The air was still, unnervingly so. "It's the highway," Derek said, his voice shaky. "We made it back." Ethan turned in a slow circle, his heart pounding. The road stretched endlessly in both directions, but there was no sign of their car, no sign of civilization. The mountains loomed in the distance, their peaks shrouded in mist. "Something's wrong," Ethan muttered. Derek frowned. "What do you mean? We're out, aren't we?" Ethan didn't answer. His eyes locked on the ground, where faint symbols were etched into the asphalt, glowing faintly before fading into nothing. "It's not over," Ethan said, his voice low. Derek shook his head. "Don't say that. We're out. We're free." A faint sound broke the stillness, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like footsteps on the road behind them. Ethan turned sharply, his breath catching in his throat. In the distance, barely visible through the haze, was a figure. It was Naomi. She stood motionless, her silhouette dark against the golden light. Her head tilted slightly, and though her face was too far away to see clearly, Ethan could feel her eyes on him. "Naomi," Derek called, taking a hesitant step forward. Ethan grabbed his arm, his grip tight. "Don't." "What?" "It's her," Derek said, his voice breaking. "She made it out." Ethan shook his head, his stomach sinking. "That's not her." The figure began to move, gliding toward them silently, its form flickering like a mirage. The closer it came, the more wrong it appeared, its movements too smooth, its edges too sharp. Derek's face crumpled, his shoulders slumping. "No," he whispered. The figure stopped a few yards away, close enough now that they could see its face. It was Naomi, but her expression was blank, her eyes glowing faintly with the same eerie light as the doppelgangers. She opened her mouth, and her voice echoed around them, distorted and hollow. "You left me." Ethan's breath hitched. "We didn't." "You left me," she repeated, stepping closer. Derek stumbled back, shaking his head. "We didn't have a choice." The figure tilted its head, a cold smile spreading across its face. "Neither do I." The ground beneath them trembled, and the sky darkened, the golden light fading into a deep, suffocating black. Ethan grabbed Derek's arm, his voice urgent. "Run!" But there was nowhere to go. The darkness enveloped them, swallowing the highway, the mountains, and the horizon. Ethan's heart pounded as the figure, Naomi, or what was left of her, advanced, her glowing eyes unblinking, her smile cold and sharp. "You left me," she repeated, her voice resonating like 1,000 whispers layered atop each other. Ethan pulled Derek, forcing him to stumble backward. "We need to move," he shouted, though there was no visible escape. Derek resisted, his body frozen in place, his eyes locked on the figure. "It's her," he murmured, his voice breaking. "We can save her." "That's not her!" Ethan roared, his voice cracking. The ground beneath them shifted violently, splitting open into jagged fissures. Glowing symbols reappeared, etched into the cracks, pulsing with blinding intensity. The air grew thick, almost liquid, as if the town itself was forcing them to stay. "Ethan," Derek whispered, his gaze distant, his body trembling. Ethan turned, realizing too late that Derek's reflection shimmered faintly in the darkness, mirroring his every move. Derek's face twisted with terror, his mouth opening in a silent scream as his body contorted unnaturally. The figure that looked like Naomi extended a hand toward Derek, her fingers elongating into shadowy tendrils. "Join me," she said softly, her voice almost kind. Derek fell to his knees, his movements erratic as if he were fighting an invisible force. "I can't," he gasped. "I can't leave her." Ethan reached for him, grabbing his shoulders and shaking him. "Derek, listen to me. This isn't real. It's the town. It's using her." Derek's eyes flickered with recognition for a brief moment. He nodded faintly, his body slackening under Ethan's grip. "Go," he whispered. "What?" Derek looked up at him, his eyes filled with tears. "You can still get out, but not both of us." "No," Ethan said firmly. "We're not doing this again." "You don't have a choice," Derek said, his voice steady now. He turned toward the figure, his expression calm despite the fear etched into his features. "If someone has to stay, it's going to be me," Ethan shouted, tightening his grip, but Derek shoved him backward with surprising force. Ethan stumbled, losing his balance as the ground beneath him tilted. The fissures glowed brighter, the symbols blinding, and the air filled with a deafening hum. The figure's tendrils wrapped around Derek, lifting him effortlessly into the air. He didn't struggle, his gaze fixed on Ethan. "Don't waste this," he said, his voice barely audible over the rising cacophony. The ground beneath Ethan shifted again, pulling him away from the scene. He screamed Derek's name, clawing at the earth as he was dragged toward a swirling vortex of light that had opened behind him. "No, stop!" Ethan roared, his voice breaking as the light swallowed him whole. Ethan woke up on the side of a highway, the early morning sun bathing the asphalt in a golden glow. He gasped for air, his lungs burning as if he'd been holding his breath for hours. He sat up slowly, his body aching. The world around him was eerily quiet, the only sound the faint rustle of the wind through the trees. "Derek," he called, his voice hoarse. There was no answer. He climbed to his feet, his legs shaky, and turned in a slow circle. The highway stretched out in both directions, empty and desolate. There was no sign of Derek, no sign of the town. Ethan staggered toward the shoulder of the road, his mind racing. His memory was fragmented, flashes of the town and the glowing symbols swirling together in a chaotic haze. As he reached into his pocket for his phone, his hand brushed against something unfamiliar. He pulled it out, a small, smooth shard of glass, its surface etched with a faint spiral symbol. His stomach turned. He looked up, and for a moment the highway shimmered. In the distance, just for a heartbeat, he saw the faint outline of the town, the diner, the clock tower, the twisting streets. And standing in the middle of it was Derek, his figure pale and indistinct. Ethan's chest tightened as Derek raised a hand, his face frozen in an eerie smile. The town disappeared as quickly as it had come, leaving Ethan alone on the road. His phone buzzed in his pocket, startling him. He fumbled for it and saw a message from Naomi's number, though he knew that was impossible. "It's watching." Ethan stared at the screen, his hand trembling. The faint sound of footsteps echoed behind him. He didn't dare turn around.